In the chronicles of Roman history, few individuals have ignited as much debate and intrigue as Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Augustus, remembered by history as Elagabalus. At merely 14 years old, this Syrian adolescent ascended to the helm of the world's most formidable empire, introducing religious customs and personal conduct that would astound even Rome's culturally diverse population. His 4-year rule disrupted virtually every norm within Roman society, governance, and religion. Elagabalus' story is more than a tale of imperial indulgence or adolescent recklessness. It symbolizes a confrontation between East and West, between entrenched Roman ideals and imported spiritual customs, between conventional gender roles and provocative self-expression. His reign exposed deep societal rifts and contributed to the larger crisis that engulfed the empire throughout the 3rd century. To comprehend the full weight of Elagabalus' significance, we must first consider the historical backdrop of his era. The early 3rd century marked a phase of sweeping transformation in Rome. Though the empire had reached its maximum territorial reach under Trajan, underlying weaknesses were beginning to emerge. Mounting pressure from barbarian forces, fiscal turmoil, and political instability created an air of unpredictability that came to define the time. The Severan dynasty, into which Elagabalus was born, introduced African and Syrian elements into the core of Roman authority. His great-great-uncle, Septimius Severus, had founded this dynasty by force of arms, and his heirs continued to depend heavily on military allegiance for their rule. This reliance on the armed forces is key to understanding how a young Syrian priest could ascend to the imperial throne. Syria was a region steeped in ancient heritage and diverse spiritual traditions. For ages, it had served as a meeting point for Greek, Persian, Roman, and Semitic influences. Its religious legacy predated Rome by millennia, tracing back to the earliest human civilizations. Among these ancient beliefs was the veneration of the sun god Elagabal, whose high priest Elagabalus would become. The cult of Elagabal centered around a sacred black stone, believed to be a meteorite, enshrined in a grand temple in Emesa. This solar deity was linked to fertility, divinity, and kingship. The worship involved elaborate rites that included music, dancing, and practices that Romans perceived as deeply alien. The priests of Elagabal wielded immense authority within Syrian society, serving not just spiritual but also civic roles. Julia Domna, the Syrian-born empress and wife of Septimius Severus, had introduced these Eastern elements into the Roman imperial court. Her sister, Julia Maesa, along with her daughters Julia Soaemias and Julia Mamaea, continued this legacy, achieving a level of influence that far surpassed the traditional roles allotted to Roman women. It was this formidable circle of Syrian women who engineered Elagabalus' ascent. The circumstances that enabled a teenaged priest to become ruler of the Roman world began with the assassination of Caracalla in 117 AD. Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect responsible for Caracalla's murder, seized the throne, but failed to win the allegiance of the Eastern legions. The Syrian imperial women seized upon this weakness to stage a return to power. Julia Maesa, having been banished by Macrinus, launched a meticulous plot. She disseminated the claim that her grandson Elagabalus was in fact the illegitimate offspring of the beloved Caracalla. Whether this assertion was truthful or fabricated, it provided a crucial line of dynastic legitimacy against Macrinus. The young priest, bearing a striking likeness to Caracalla and exuding a magnetic foreign appeal, became the centerpiece of a rebellion that would unsettle the empire. The insurrection commenced in May 218 AD at the military encampment near Emesa. Julia Maesa secured the loyalty of key officers and troops by promising lavish donatives and increased wages. When Elagabalus appeared before the 3rd Gallic Legion, adorned in imperial purple and proclaiming to be Caracalla's son, the soldiers hailed him as emperor. The revolt spread quickly throughout the eastern provinces, fueled by word of the boy's imperial claim and his pledges of reward. Macrinus, taken aback by the rapid escalation, attempted to crush the uprising with force. Yet his army suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Antioch in June 218 AD. His authority crumbled as legion after legion switched allegiance to the teenage contender. Fleeing toward Rome, Macrinus was eventually captured and executed before he could reach the capital. The triumph at Antioch left Elagabalus, just 14 years old, as the ruler of the Roman Empire. Still, the real power rested with his grandmother Julia Maesa and his mother Julia Soamis, the architects of his rise. They understood that retaining control meant carefully navigating both the military and the Senate. What they may not have foreseen was their young protege's desire to pursue his own ambitions. The long journey from Syria to Rome lasted more than a year, during which Elagabalus solidified his authority and began to reveal his individual disposition. In contrast to earlier boy emperors who passively allowed guardians to rule in their stead, Elagabalus quickly showed a desire to wield real power. One of his first moves was to purge the supporters of Macrinus and appoint loyalists to influential positions. As this transitional period unfolded, disconcerting accounts began to filter into Rome regarding the emperor's actions and intentions. Rumors spread of his unfamiliar religious customs, his eccentric appearance, and his determination to overhaul Roman worship. Traditional Romans, already wary of Eastern religious infiltration, became increasingly apprehensive about what this priest-king from Syria intended to impose upon their city. Elagabalus's arrival in Rome in 1919 AD marked the start of one of the most contentious reigns in the empire's annals. The young ruler entered not as a Roman general basking in military glory, but as an Eastern monarch surrounded by the pomp of Syrian nobility. His appearance alone scandalized Roman observers. He wore flowing silk garments, elaborate cosmetics, and ornate jewelry that defied Roman masculine norms. Yet more unsettling than his appearance was what he carried with him, the sacred black stone of Elagabalus. This meteorite, meticulously transported from Emesa, was destined for enshrinement in a new temple on the Palatine Hill. For Romans, this act amounted to an extraordinary religious upheaval. Never before had a foreign god been granted such prominence in the imperial heart of Rome. The religious upheaval initiated by Elagabalus extended far beyond the mere incorporation of another deity into the Roman pantheon. He declared Elagabalus to be the highest god, surpassing even Jupiter in status. The traditional Roman deities were to be placed beneath this Syrian solar god. Elagabalus himself took on the role of the deity's chief priest, conducting daily rites that many Romans found unsettling and alien. The ceremonies devoted to Elagabalus included aspects that clashed with Roman religious norms. Sacred music, frenzied dancing, and ornate processions became a daily feature of life in the capital. The emperor actively participated in these rites, dressed in full priestly attire, which included flowing garments and a crown encrusted in jewels. To the conservative Roman public, these acts appeared to be a direct assault on their religious heritage. The sexual and gender dynamics within these religious practices proved even more provocative. The worship of Elagabalus involved fertility rituals and expressions of gender fluidity rooted in ancient Syrian customs, but entirely foreign to Roman tradition. The emperor's personal involvement in these ceremonies, including wearing feminine clothing and adopting effeminate behavior during certain rites, shocked Roman sensibilities. His private relationships quickly became the subject of intense gossip and public indignation. His initial marriage to Julia Paula, a noble Roman woman, ended within a year, and he soon wed Aquilia Severa, a Vestal virgin. This marriage violated one of Rome's most sacred religious principles, as Vestals were consecrated to Vesta and sworn to lifelong chastity. The union was interpreted as both blasphemous and a direct challenge to Roman religious law. Even more disturbing to Roman values were Elagabalus's romantic liaisons with men. Ancient accounts, especially by Cassius Dio and the Historia Augusta, detail his marriages to male partners, including a charioteer named Heracles and later an athlete named Zodicus. These relationships were conducted with full matrimonial ceremony, with Elagabalus assuming the role of the wife. The emperor's gender presentation grew increasingly fluid and contentious. Contemporary sources depict him wearing women's wigs, cosmetics, and dresses, and requesting to be referred to as empress rather than emperor. Some records claim he even sought surgical transformation, offering large sums to any physician capable of physically altering his body to resemble that of a woman. While the authenticity of these specific anecdotes is debated, they reflect the deep discomfort his behavior caused. These personal and religious innovations had far-reaching political consequences. The Roman Senate, already wary of Eastern cultural influences, was compelled to take part in rituals they regarded as humiliating and alien. Senators had to attend religious events in which practices defied their expectations of Roman decorum. The emperor's indifference to Roman military customs added further tension. Where past emperors had at least preserved the image of military leadership, Elagabalus showed little concern for military matters aside from maintaining the Praetorian Guard's loyalty through generous bribes.
His presence at military events in Eastern ceremonial attire, his neglect of frontier campaigns, and his promotion of civilian clergy to command positions estranged many military officers. The emperor's economic policies reflected both the extravagance of the Syrian court and his detachment from Roman financial realities. Enormous sums were spent on religious festivities, lavish rewards for favorites, and grand temple constructions, placing a heavy strain on state finances. Roman ideals of modesty and self-restraint were replaced by Eastern notions of royal opulence. The imperial court turned into a display of indulgence that appalled traditional Romans. Extravagant feasts showcased exotic delicacies, and performances featuring acts seen as depraved by Roman standards, all staged with luxury that rivaled or surpassed even the excesses of Caligula or Nero. Elagabalus presided over these occasions in multiple elaborate outfits, sometimes changing attire several times during a single banquet. Intrigue within the palace intensified as different factions vied for control over the young ruler. Syrian nobles, Roman senators clinging to influence, military leaders, and religious functionaries all jockeyed for prominence. Members of the emperor's own family walked a precarious line between advancing his goals and safeguarding their positions. The transformation of the imperial residence into what resembled a Syrian religious compound was a tangible expression of the cultural overhaul Elagabalus was pursuing. Elements of traditional Roman architecture were replaced or overshadowed by Eastern design motifs. The sacred black stone of Elagabal was installed in a specially designed sanctuary that became the centerpiece of the palace grounds. The daily routine within the palace came to revolve around religious observances that consumed growing amounts of time and resources. Several ceremonies were held each day, requiring the full participation of the emperor and his entourage. These rituals often lasted hours and included practices that Roman observers considered tiresome and meaningless. Elagabalus's insistence on personally overseeing each rite meant that governmental affairs were often interrupted or postponed. The psychological toll on those forced to attend these rituals was significant. Roman dignitaries and officials were expected not only to witness, but sometimes to participate in ceremonies that contradicted their beliefs and cultural norms. Some accommodated this by treating the rituals as diplomatic obligations, while others began conspiring against the regime. Foreign emissaries and visiting elites were subjected to the same ritual requirements, leading to diplomatic embarrassments that tarnished Rome's international image. Long-standing allies became uncertain about how to interact with the ruler who prioritized religious pageantry over governance. Rival powers started to view Rome as weakened by internal disarray and distracted leadership. Public sentiment toward these transformations grew increasingly hostile. While some citizens were initially intrigued by the exotic rituals, most came to view them as intrusive disruptions to long-standing Roman religious life. The emperor's edict to modify traditional Roman festivals to honor Elagabal met with widespread discontent. Popular entertainments like the gladiatorial games, central to Roman civic life, were altered to include religious components that diminished their appeal. Traditional spectacles like beast hunts and combat matches were replaced or supplemented with religious performances that the public found dull and confusing. Elagabalus's appearances at these events, dressed in elaborate Eastern attire, drew more and more hostility. The financial burden of the emperor's religious initiatives began to impact everyday Romans. Increased taxes were levied to fund his religious projects and the luxuries of his court. Merchants faced interruptions to commerce due to frequent religious observances and obligatory participation in ceremonies. craftsmen were conscripted to produce ritual objects and decorative items for the never-ending sequence of religious events. Meanwhile, the military situation declined, with border defenses neglected in favor of court rituals. Reports of barbarian rage became more frequent as the emperor devoted his attention to spiritual affairs. Veteran commanders began to question the fitness of a leader whose priorities lay in the temple rather than the battlefield. Provincial governance suffered as local administrators were tasked with enforcing imperial religious reforms that met with resistance. In some regions, especially in the western provinces, open defiance of these religious mandates began to surface. The emperor's typical response was to impose harsher penalties for dissent rather than to address the underlying grievances. The turning point arrived when Elagabalus began to disrupt traditional Roman marriage customs and familial norms. His endorsement of sexual behaviors and partnerships that Romans viewed as deviant triggered a crisis of societal legitimacy. When he attempted to codify these changes through legislative reforms, resistance solidified into overt opposition. Julia Maesa, the emperor's own grandmother and architect of his ascent, began to perceive that his rule endangered the dynasty's future. Discreet correspondence with influential military leaders and senators revealed a growing consensus that a change in leadership was necessary. The challenge lay in selecting a successor who could uphold Syrian influence while discarding the most divisive elements of Elagabalus's regime. The elevation of Alexander Severus, Elagabalus's cousin, as an alternative figure was a strategic effort to safeguard the dynasty while removing its most controversial member. Alexander was younger, more pliable, and crucially untainted by the religious extremism that defined his cousin's tenure. Julia Maesa began systematically building support for a transfer of power that would depose Elagabalus while keeping authority within the family. Dissent within the military, particularly among the Praetorian Guard, became a focal point of opposition. Though their allegiance had been purchased through generous payments, the Guard's tolerance was waning. Elagabalus's neglect of military traditions, promotion of unqualified confidants to command roles, and overt disinterest in military affairs had alienated even those who had profited under him. The conspiracy to depose Elagabalus began to coalesce in the early months of 222 AD. Principal conspirators included his own grandmother, high-ranking senators, commanders of the Praetorian Guard, and court officials who had grown weary of incessant ceremonial obligations. The scheme required meticulous planning to ensure that the transition would be both swift and decisive. Elagabalus's mental condition had reportedly deteriorated as resistance to his reign intensified. Ancient narratives recount incidents of paranoia, outbursts of anger, and erratic conduct, indicating that the strain of power was taking a serious toll. His typical response to criticism was to escalate punishments and increase the number of religious ceremonies. Signs of impending crisis multiplied during the winter of 221-222 AD. The emperor's deepening estrangement from traditional sources of support, combined with his apparent incapacity to perceive the extent of hostility toward his leadership, fostered a scenario in which violent upheaval seemed inevitable. Even those closest to him began to withdraw as the political situation unraveled. The assassination of Elagabalus occurred on March 11, 222 AD, during what was expected to be a routine appearance at the Praetorian camp. The emperor had arrived with his cousin Alexander Severus, intending to address the troops, unaware that the gathering was the culmination of a coordinated plot. Upon his arrival, he encountered guards who had already pledged allegiance to Alexander. What followed was a chaotic and violent scene. Elagabalus attempted to assert control, but his usual imperial authority had no effect on soldiers determined to unseat him. Attempts to escape proved futile, as the conspirators had accounted for every possible contingency. The young emperor, once the absolute master of the empire, was now helpless before the very forces that had elevated him. The execution of Elagabalus was rapid and brutal. Contemporary sources describe how the 18-year-old ruler was attacked by multiple assailants to ensure he could not survive. His mother, Julia Soaemius, who had accompanied him, was killed as well. The Syrian faction of the imperial family was effectively wiped out in moments. The treatment of their remains delivered a final symbolic rejection of all Elagabalus had embodied. Instead of receiving the customary cremation and burial accorded to Roman emperors, the bodies were dragged through the streets of the capital and thrown into the Tiber River. This disposal, typically reserved for criminals and traitors, sent a powerful message about the posthumous judgment of his rule. In the immediate wake of the assassination, there was a concerted effort to undo Elagabalus's religious and cultural reforms. The sacred stone of Elagabal was returned to Syria, temples dedicated to the Eastern deity were rededicated to traditional Roman gods, and the elaborate rituals that had dominated the court were discontinued. Under the guidance of his mother, Julia Mammea, and grandmother, Julia Maesa, Alexander Severus began reinstating conventional Roman practices. The damnatio memoriae issued against Elagabalus was sweeping, though not entirely effective. While official documents were altered and inscriptions defaced, the memory of his reign endured in historical narratives and popular recollection. The very extremity of his reforms ensured they would not be forgotten, even if they served only as a cautionary tale. The historical interpretation of Elagabalus has shifted significantly over time. Ancient writers such as Cassius Dio and the compilers of the Historia Augusta cast him as a moral abomination, whose rule exemplified the dangers of Eastern influence on Roman culture. Medieval historians largely adopted this condemning view, often amplifying the moral critiques of his sexual and spiritual conduct. Modern scholarship has sought to distinguish between factual history and ancient bias, recognizing that much of our knowledge comes from hostile sources. Contemporary historians acknowledge that Roman authors were inclined to view Eastern customs as corrupt and decadent, making an impartial assessment of Elagabalus's reforms difficult. Particular scholarly attention has focused on Elagabalus's gender identity. Some modern historians argue that the ancient records describe behaviors that would today be identified as transgender, suggesting that Elagabalus may have been the first known transgender monarch. Others assert that his conduct should be interpreted through the lens of Syrian religious tradition rather than present-day gender frameworks.
The religious reforms pursued by Elagabalus offer an early instance of syncretic experimentation, a trend that would later become more common in the Roman Empire. His ambition to establish a supreme solar deity foreshadowed aspects of Constantine's later religious policies. Nonetheless, the manner and moment of Elagabalus's efforts ensured their ultimate failure. The political implications of Elagabalus's rule reach beyond matters of religion and social reform. His life underscores the perils that arise when rulers become detached from the populations they govern. Regardless of how limitless a sovereign's authority may appear, it ultimately rests on the approval or passive acceptance of influential societal factions. When that support is withdrawn, even an emperor can be overthrown. The involvement of Syrian women in both elevating and orchestrating the fall of Elagabalus highlights the intricate power dynamics of the Roman imperial system. Julia Maesa's willingness to sacrifice her own grandson to safeguard the dynasty underscores how strategic necessity could override familial bonds. The smooth handover to Alexander Severus demonstrated that the conspiracy had been executed with precision to avoid destabilization. The financial and bureaucratic dimensions of Elagabalus's rule shed light on the practical difficulties confronting the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. His excessive expenditures and failure to uphold frontier defenses exacerbated issues that would trouble subsequent emperors. Though the empire's treasury was vast, it was not inexhaustible, and economic mismanagement brought tangible repercussions. The military aspect of his reign illustrates the rising influence of the army in imperial succession. Even as formal constitutional frameworks remained intact, true authority increasingly lay with those who could command the loyalty of armed forces. Elagabalus's neglect of military responsibilities proved ultimately fatal to his administration. Culturally, the effects of his reign extended beyond its immediate political fallout. The tension between Eastern and Western traditions that defined Elagabalus's rule mirrored deeper struggles within the empire concerning cultural identity and allegiance. These conflicts would continue to shape Roman society well after his death. The way historians have portrayed Elagabalus raises critical questions about the depiction of gender nonconforming and sexually diverse figures in the historical record. Ancient authors hostile to his rule may have exaggerated or misrepresented his conduct to advance arguments against Eastern influence and to defend Roman values. New archaeological discoveries in Emesa and other Syrian locations have offered greater understanding of the religious customs Elagabalus tried to introduce to Rome. These findings indicate that his reforms, far from being inexplicable oddities, reflected legitimate Syrian religious practices rather than mere personal indulgence.
The psychological aspects of Elagabalus's narrative continue to captivate both academics and the general public. The burden of supreme authority placed upon an adolescent, compounded by the cultural dislocation of relocating from Syria to Rome, created circumstances that would have challenged even the most mature and seasoned individuals. His seeming refusal or inability to adjust to Roman norms may have stemmed from a combination of temperament and upbringing. In popular culture, the image of Elagabalus has been heavily shaped by the more lurid elements of ancient texts. From Renaissance artwork to modern literature and cinema, he has often been cast as an icon of decadence and excess. These portrayals tend to reflect more about the eras that produced them than about the historical figure they depict. The larger historical meaning of Elagabalus's reign lies in what it reveals about Rome's capacity for transformation and resilience. While his particular changes were rejected, the empire would later undergo religious and cultural shifts of comparable magnitude. His downfall may have stemmed more from inappropriate timing and flawed execution than from the inherent unfeasibility of his vision. Ultimately, Elagabalus's story serves as a potent reminder of the challenges of interpreting history and the perils of unchecked authority. Whether seen as a visionary misunderstood, a troubled youth, or a manifestation of Eastern decadence, he remains one of antiquity's most enigmatic and divisive characters. His short rule exposed rifts and possibilities within Roman society that would resonate throughout the empire's continued evolution. The emperor who sought to reshape Rome according to his ideals instead precipitated his own demise and left behind a historical enigma that continues to intrigue scholars and ignite the imagination more than 18 centuries later.